So, something big just happened in Europe. Spain recently signed a whole bunch of new deals with China. And, this wasn't just some standard trade announcement. It was a move that sent some serious ripples across the continent. And it's really challenging the whole idea of a unified European foreign policy. So, let's get into why this is such a massive deal. At first glance, you might think, okay, it's just business. But underneath all that, there's this high-stakes geopolitical game being played, where one country's move can literally change the entire board for everyone else. Today, we're going to unpack exactly why Spain's big pivot has become such a critical test for the unity of Europe. Okay, so first things first. To really get why Spain's actions are causing such a stir, we need to understand the European Union's official playbook for dealing with China. And let me tell you, it's complicated. And that's kind of the point.
So, Brussels has this fancy term for it, the tripartite framing. All that really means is that the EU tries to look at China as three different things, all at the same time. It's their attempt to be pragmatic, but as you can probably guess, trying to juggle all three of those identities is incredibly tricky.
So, what are these three hats the EU makes China wear? Well, first, China is a partner, right? They work together on huge global issues like climate change and trade. Second, China is an economic competitor, especially in the race for new technology and market share. And third, and this is a big one, China is a systemic rival. That means its whole model of government and its core values are just fundamentally different from Europe's. Partner, competitor, rival. See what I mean? It's this constant, super delicate balancing act.
Okay, so with that in mind, this is where Spain comes into the picture. They've decided to step in and just tilt that whole carefully balanced scale all on their own. Madrid is charting a very different course, and they're not being quiet about it. And I mean, just look at the sheer scale of this. This isn't some small, under-the-radar thing. We're talking about Spain signing 10 brand new bilateral deals. 10! They cover everything from farming exports to green infrastructure. It's a really clear, really loud statement of intent. Now, here's a really important point. Technically, Spain isn't breaking any EU laws. The system allows for member states to make their own deals. But what it is doing is breaking from this sort of unwritten agreement, this consensus that's been building in Brussels, a consensus that's been getting more and more wary of Beijing.
So what Spain's really doing is looking at those three labels, partner, competitor, rival, and they've decided to put a heavy thumb on the scale right in favor of partner. And that right there creates this huge gap. So you've got the EU leadership in Brussels talking more and more about de-risking from China and focusing on the rivalry. Meanwhile, Spain is over there rolling out the red carpet, all about cooperation and investment. They're basically speaking a different language, even though they're technically reading from the same playbook.
And look, this isn't just talk. The numbers, the actual actions, they tell the story. In 2024, Spain had the highest projected level of Chinese investment in the entire European Union. And get this, when the EU voted on putting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, what did Spain do? They abstained. They sat it out. Plus, they've been way slower than other countries to restrict what are called high-risk vendors from their 5G networks. These are real choices with real consequences. So what's the big deal? What's the real cost here? Well, when a major player like Spain decides to go its own way, it starts to show cracks in what's supposed to be this solid European wall. And this is why it's not just a Spain problem. It's an everyone in Europe problem. When countries start cutting their own side deals, it makes the whole EU weaker at the bargaining table. It's classic divide and conquer, right? It lets Beijing play member states against each other. And maybe the most dangerous part? It sets an example. If other countries see Spain's move paying off, they might just decide to do the same thing. All of this puts Spain in this really fascinating but also really risky spot. They're trying to be a bridge, but you gotta ask, what happens if that bridge is built right over a geopolitical earthquake fault line? Yeah, strategically, they want to be what's called a bridge node. The idea is simple. They want to be the main hub, the essential gateway for Chinese trade, tech, and money flowing into Europe, and of course, the other way around. And on paper, it looks brilliant. Spain has huge ambitions in green tech, which makes it a perfect partner for China. And then there's the Latin America connection. Spain's historic and language ties there are a golden ticket for China into those markets. In theory, Spain could be the perfect go-between. But, and this is the huge but, what happens when that beautiful bridge starts to look more like a crack, a fault line? because the same strategy that offers so much promise also carries an incredible amount of risk. And the risks here are absolutely massive. You get too cozy economically, and suddenly you're vulnerable. Your big new partner can start pulling your strings. It also creates a ton of friction with your allies in the EU and NATO, especially when Chinese investment starts touching sensitive things like ports, the energy grid, or data networks. And hey, you don't have to take my word for it. A top-tier European think tank, Merix, they basically spelled it out. They said if Spain gets too dependent on Chinese money in these critical areas, it becomes vulnerable to being pushed around or influenced. In other words, that bridge can pretty quickly turn into a leash. So let's pull the camera back for a second. This whole thing with Spain, it's not just about Spain. It's really a snapshot of this much bigger debate, maybe even an identity crisis, happening all across Europe right now. And here's the thing. Spain isn't the only one feeling this way. The EU is getting more and more split on its China policy. You've basically got these camps forming. There's team cooperation with countries like Spain and Hungary. Then there's team skeptic with Germany and the Baltic states leading the charge. And then there's this big group of countries stuck in the middle, trying to figure out which way to jump. The consensus is clearly breaking down. So where do we go from here? What should we be watching? Well, the next year or two will be a huge test. We need to keep an eye on three things. First, the money. Do these investment deals start to look less like partnerships and more like dependencies? Second, watch the votes in the EU. Does this kind of solo action become the new normal? And third, watch Spain's foreign policy. Does it start to drift away from the rest of its Western allies? And really, this all boils down to one huge fundamental question. In a really tough global economy, is the need for national economic survival starting to shout louder than the call for a shared, unified ideological front? Spain's actions seem to suggest that for some, the answer is yes. Which leaves us, and all of Europe, with this final, incredibly tough question. What's the ultimate price of unity? And maybe more importantly, what's the price of going it alone? There are definitely no easy answers here.